So pleasure. Today's January 3rd. Welcome. And I just want to introduce first Julie Westwater. And Julie's the general, not a bad picture at all, Julie. I like the picture. General Counsel at the Commonwealth of Massachusetts Disabled Persons Protection Commission. She represents the commission in all legal matters. And you'll all get a copy of this. So I'm not going to go through all the background, but I did learn about her attaining the rank of captain in the U.S. Army. That was pretty damn impressive. And as an intelligence officer and paratrooper, which would have me very nervous. But she's played some very important roles, including private practice, San Diego as public defender. So she really has a great background as legal counsel. So, and then I also want to include Sarah Nechamen. And Sarah is an outreach and training specialist with DPPC. She has several years of experience developing trainings for government agencies and a master's degree in learning design and technology from Purdue. Yeah, great school. And she's been working to spread the word about DPPC and the agency's hotline. And I don't think you can do enough of that. I think it's an ongoing process. So I really appreciate you being with us and look forward to, she will start the session off in a couple of minutes and we're going to switch hosting screens in a minute. But I just want to give you guys an update. This is probably not a surprise to you unless you've been sleeping for the last week. Bottom line, it's doubled, more than doubled. The last time we had a session, which was the 20th, we had about 42,000 growth in a week, 7 day. Now it's close to pretty much 99,000. So it's more than doubled the growth. So that's pretty scary. But, and it's really, when you look back to November 2020, our last surge, we've exceeded November 2020's numbers already. And, you know, so just to put in context, the common care system, 156 positive cases. It was only about 45 the last time we talked. And I can tell you anecdotally, I've gotten emails from all over, probably 5 emails from colleagues. I'll be talking with more today. Talked to 3 colleagues early this morning. It's rampant, the virus in common care settings. And, you know, it's just rampant. It seems the hospitalizations are fewer. But, you know, for the last 2 months, we've had less than 5 deaths. We had no deaths before that for a number of months. So that's concerning, okay? And so I wanted to share this with you, COVID. We've reached out to see there can be more testing, especially the easier tests, you know, because we know that PCR tests take longer. Maybe as a gap, safety gap, you do the quick tests, rapid tests, excuse me, that's the right language. And I've done 2 of them myself in the past week, just for safety purposes. So it'd be great to get those out to organizations and because our constituency is more at risk, as we know. So anyway, without further ado, a really, you know, related to this, but bigger than this issue is people's health, welfare, freedom from abuse and neglect, be able to exercise their human rights, all that stuff that we so strongly believe in. I'm really pleased, Sarah, that you're with us to get the ball started and begin your presentation. I'm going to stop sharing. And I think you're down as co-host, so you should be able to share your screen.
Okay.
Welcome again, Sarah. Pleasure to have you with us.
Yeah. Awesome. Oops. All right. Hello, everybody. Like Leo said in that wonderful introduction, my name is Sarah Nechamen, and I'm going to be talking about reporting abuse and neglect of persons with disabilities to the Disabled Persons Protection Commission, or the DPPC. So for anyone who's not familiar with the DPPC, we are an independent state agency. We investigate abuse against adults with disabilities. So that's people between the ages of 18 and 59. When that abuse is perpetrated by a caregiver, and that caregiver can be paid, they can be unpaid, anybody who is helping the individual meet their daily living needs. And if you ever want more information about our agency, our website is at the bottom here. So the way this works is when a report of abuse comes into our hotline, the intake specialist who's managing the hotline will ask a few questions, the who, the when, the what happened, and then they will determine if it meets our jurisdiction. And if it does, it will be assigned to an investigator, either within DPPC or at one of our partner agencies. And that investigator will conduct a civil investigation. They'll do the fact finding, right? So they'll conduct interviews, they'll review evidence, and they'll figure out what actually happened. And if they determine that yes, abuse did happen, they will make these protective services recommendations to make sure that the victim can move on from the abuse and gets the support that they need, and to make sure that abuse doesn't happen again. So that can include recommendations around training, around policies and procedures, maintenance of equipment, healthcare and counseling for the victim, and things along those lines. At the same time that the investigator is conducting their investigation, we have a state police detective unit, which works alongside DPPC and screens every report that comes in for criminal activity. So they can conduct their criminal investigation at the same time that the investigator is conducting their civil investigation. Our sexual assault response unit is also screening cases that come in, looking for cases of sexual abuse and sexual assault, and they will work directly with the survivor to get them resources, to get them support, to get them counseling and healthcare and things like that. One really useful resource that SAR provides is the peer support system. So peer support leaders work with survivors directly. These are DPPC staff who are survivors of sexual assault and have an intellectual or developmental disability. So they will work with other survivors with these disabilities and share their story so that the survivors can kind of see that they're not alone, and they'll help them work towards hope and empowerment. They also do a lot of other work. They promote inclusiveness of people with disabilities through advocacy and networking. They reach out to community stakeholders. They work with professionals and providers to help them view survivors through a trauma-informed lens rather than just through a disability lens. So that's a really important part of the work we do. So who can report to DPPC? People with disabilities can report when they themselves have experienced abuse. Families of people with disabilities can report. Friends and peers. Mandated reporters, who are people who, because of their profession, are legally required to report. These are people like police officers and teachers and doctors, and really anybody else. So I believe on this call we have primarily people with disabilities and families, so I really want to emphasize that anybody, including everybody on this call, can report to DPPC. And in fact should, because the victimization rate for people with disabilities is a full 2.5 times higher than for people without disabilities. Okay, and people who are facing abuse are likely to face it 10 or more times throughout their lifetime. So the stats are really, really troubling for people with disabilities. And the reason for that is that there are all of these risk factors that people with disabilities face for abuse and for violence. One of those is social isolation. So if you don't have a support network, if you don't have people checking up on you as much, there might not be as many people that can notice the signs of abuse. So it's especially important that when you do notice signs of abuse, that you're able to report it. Sometimes there's this culture of compliance that people with disabilities might have been told their entire lives to, obey a caregiver just because of their role. So then when something is wrong, when there is abuse happening, they might not have the self-advocacy skills to say stop. Sometimes there is difficulty identifying abuse, either due to the nature of the disability or due to a lack of proper sex ed or education on healthy relationships in the school system. There can be communication barriers. When somebody definitely knows that they are being abused, they may not be able to communicate that to someone. And even if they do communicate it to someone, they may not be believed. So this is a huge, huge problem. Often people with disabilities are not believed when they report abuse. Often people don't want to report because they think they won't be believed. So at DPPC, we always say that we start by believing. That's kind of one of the key mottos of SAR and of DPPC as a whole. Now, sometimes people get to this point in the presentation and they say, you know, I understand the risk factors, I understand the vulnerabilities, but, you know, I work with people who live in the community, who are surrounded by friends and family. You know, abuse couldn't possibly happen there. We get reports, we do investigations, abuse happens there. Or they'll say, you know, these people are in day programs or group homes, they're surrounded by professionals who are trained to do these jobs. You know, abuse couldn't possibly happen there. Again, we get reports, we do investigations, abuse definitely happens there. Or in transportation vehicles, you know, they're only in there for 20 minutes, but we get a lot of reports in transportation vehicles. Also in school programs, work and day programs, state-run facilities, abuse can really happen anywhere. And that's important to keep in mind, because if we start to think that there is that one safe place where, you know, abuse couldn't possibly happen, then when we hear information that contradicts that, our brains kind of try to make it make sense, right? We start thinking, well, maybe it didn't actually happen. Maybe someone got confused. Maybe something else went down. Okay, so we have to remember that abuse can happen anywhere. So let's talk about what is actually reportable. And I want to talk about this through a scenario, just to give us some context. So we have this guy, Arthur, and Arthur has an intellectual disability and attends a day program outside of town. His sister notices that he's recently come back from the day program with these injuries and that he's been more withdrawn than usual. And she suspects some sort of abuse is happening at the program, but she has no proof. She hasn't seen anybody abuse Arthur, and Arthur hasn't told her anything. And the question is, can Arthur's sister report to DPPC? And the answer is yes, because you don't need proof to report to DPPC. The standard for reporting in Massachusetts is reasonable cause to believe that abuse or neglect exists. You can also think about this like suspicion, right? Suspicion is not, I am 100% sure that this is exactly what's happening. You know, I have evidence, I have conducted an investigation. It's none of that. It is just reasonable cause to believe that Arthur is being abused. Whether you know who is doing the abuse or not, still make the report. Okay. So how do you determine reasonable cause? Well, one way is you might see the abuse happen. Right? If you see Sarah punch Arthur, that's a pretty good indication that Sarah is abusing Arthur. But you might never see abuse happen, right? A lot of abuse happens behind closed doors. And if you wait until you actually see it, you might never make the report. And that's when people start getting abused, you know, 10 or more times throughout their lifetime. So if you see it happen, definitely report it, but also report if someone comes up to you and tells you that they're being abused. Okay. Whether they give you all the information or not, whether the story really makes sense to you or not, just report to DPPC and we will do all the fact finding and really find out everything that happened. If you notice an injury, that could be something that would give you reasonable cause to believe that abuse is happening, especially if you specifically think that the injury is from abuse or you don't really know where the injury came from. That can all be cause to believe. Also changes in mood or behavior, right? Abuse is traumatic. It leads to these mood changes, these behavior changes, these trauma responses. Now, specifically, what should you report? You should report suspicion of physical abuse, suspicion of emotional abuse, suspicion of sexual abuse, suspicion of neglect or omission by a caregiver. That means the caregiver was supposed to be doing something and they didn't, and the individual got injured as a result. Or deaths when you suspect that abuse played a role. Okay. So how to file an abuse report. This is the most important slide in this entire presentation. This is our hotline number. That is 1-800-426-9009. I highly recommend that you copy this down. Put it in your phone, put it on a piece of paper, whatever is going to help you have access to it if you ever need it. Okay. So whenever you call this number, it's a 24/7 hotline, holidays and everything. So anytime that you call this number, you will get a live person on the other end. So that was all of the vulnerabilities of abuse, how to report abuse. Now let's look into some red flags or some indicators.
Actually, can I ask a question?
Mhm.
I was curious about the suspicion part, so I was wondering if maybe, does the DPPC prefer that you report as opposed to, for instance, conducting your own investigation? Like, I was wondering if there was a...
Yeah, so we will conduct the investigation.
No, but what I meant is, like, the scenario with Arthur's sister, would you have preferred her to contact you as opposed to, for instance, conducting her own investigation and getting proof? That's, I'm wondering if there's a preference there.
Yeah, I mean, we would say that reporting is the most important thing. Our investigators are especially trained to conduct investigations and interview and collect evidence. Certainly any information that the sister has, she can give to the hotline person, but we can conduct the investigation ourselves.
So you wouldn't want the sister to run out there and try to find her own proof?
Well, Giassi, the risk of that, it's Leo, sorry to butt in, but the risk of that is the sister's probably not equipped to do it. Plus the agency may not cooperate with her. There's all kinds of reasons, right? That separate from, you know, as Sarah said, to avoid getting into that, but good question.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so we're gonna go into some red flags that may make you suspect that someone is facing abuse. Okay. So for physical abuse, red flags or indicators often look like injuries, but specific types of injuries like bruises, especially if it's somewhere that you're not likely to get a bruise accidentally. Because, you know, how many of us have woken up in the morning and looked down at our knee and be like, ooh, where did that bruise come from? I must have bumped it. So that happens, right? But how many of us have woken up in the morning, looked in the mirror and gone, ooh, where did that black eye come from? Right, must have bumped it somewhere. So that doesn't happen as much. You also want to be on the lookout for what we call bilateral bruises. These are bruises that kind of mirror each other on both sides of the body, like on the arms or on the shoulders. That can be an indication that someone is being grabbed really forcefully. You want to be on the lookout for human bite marks, especially if the person doesn't have a history of biting themselves or if it's somewhere that would be very difficult to bite yourself. Unexplained internal injuries, fractures, sprains, dislocations, any really serious injuries like that. Burns that are shaped like an object, so shaped like maybe a lighter or a cigarette or an iron. Injuries to the mouth, that can be evidence of force feeding, which is a type of physical abuse. And extreme changes in behavior, which can be an indicator for many different types of abuse. Because again, abuse is traumatic and it can cause those kind of trauma responses. Emotional abuse, this one can be a little bit harder to pin down. So I want to start with just some examples of what it is. Emotional abuse can include screaming, shouting, yelling or cursing, threatening violence, making discriminatory or degrading remarks, mimicking someone, teasing them like in a cruel way, not in a lighthearted banter way, sexual harassment, threatening to take away food or shelter or clothes, you know, anything that they need. Using demeaning labels, giving the silent treatment, using intimidating gestures. A lot of this stuff I think of as just straight up bullying, like the kind of bullying you would see in the schoolyard, but it happens very much with adults as well. Now, emotional abuse isn't always considered abuse, especially by the perpetrator. So you're more likely to actually see it, to actually witness it. So if you witness any of this stuff happening, you definitely want to make a report. But even if you don't witness it, you will still see potentially some behavioral indicators that might make you think that emotional abuse may be happening. So the person might be obsessing a lot or worrying or feeling anxious. They might be crying more often or more easily. They might have a sudden drop in self-esteem, right? A lot of the emotional abuse really goes straight to your self-esteem, right? If you're being yelled at, if you're being demeaned, if you're being mocked, a lot of that is really hard on the self-esteem. A sudden loss of appetite or weight can be a sign that maybe the person is too upset or too anxious to eat, Or they might gain appetite or gain a lot of weight, maybe because they're using food as a coping mechanism. They might start showing fear of the caregiver. This can happen with a lot of different types of abuse. They might start to show self-injurious behavior, especially if they weren't doing that before, or if you see a pattern in it, like someone is only exhibiting self-injurious behavior on a Friday, and that's when X caregiver was working. They might be emotionally withdrawn or start to lash out. They might be really distrustful. You know, if I can't trust this person, why should I trust anybody? That sort of thing. They might have trouble getting out of bed, which can be kind of a sign of depression, or trouble sleeping because of feeling really anxious again. So this is all in sexual abuse, so a quick trigger warning on that. Sexual abuse can look kind of similar to physical abuse, but on particular parts of the body. So you might see bleeding in like the genital or rectal area. You might see bruising to the inner thighs. You might see difficulty walking or sitting, or clothing or bedding that is kind of torn up or stained. The person might have exposure to sexually explicit material if they didn't before. There might be unexplained gifts from the caregiver. This is something that can look really benign, but might be a sign of something much worse. So it may at least be a reason to ask more questions. You might see frequent bathing, UTIs or STDs, right? The STDs had to come from somewhere. And again, these extreme changes in behavior. Especially if you're seeing these more than once, or if you're seeing a combination of multiple ones of these can start to be a more clear indicator of abuse. And here, when we talk about neglect and omission, I want to point out that abuse is not always intentional, right? And it doesn't have to be intentional in order to report it, right? We're not just looking for bad people doing bad things. We're looking to protect the victim's personal health and safety. So the question is, was this person's safety compromised? Okay, and remember when I talked about those protective services recommendations, right? We're not just out to get people and get them fired and things like that. We're also looking to see, does this caregiver need more training? Do they need more support? Do we need to change the staffing ratios? Do we need to change the policies and procedures? Okay, so if somebody is facing neglect, some indicators that you might see are dehydration or malnutrition. The person isn't getting enough food or water. Their medications might be outdated or unmarked or just missing. They might have bed sores or skin rashes or poor hygiene. Their hair isn't being brushed, their teeth isn't being brushed. This individual to individual abuse, this is when another person with a disability attacks or injures or abuses the victim who also has a disability. So here, because we're only looking at abuse by caregivers, we wouldn't be investigating the other individual with a disability. But what can happen is if that person has maybe a history of violence and they were supposed to be on a one-to-one supervision as a result, and the person who was supposed to be supervising them was off doing something else instead, then we would start to look into omission or neglect by the caregiver, because the caregiver wasn't doing what they were supposed to be doing, and as a result, the person got injured. And you might see someone lacking the equipment that they need, the wheelchair, the vision board, whatever it might be. Okay, so those are all of our indicators. Any of these that you see, especially if you see multiple, you would want to make a call to DPPC. This is our number again at the bottom. Again, highly recommend you write it down. This is my contact information as well. You can email me if you want more information about any of this, flyers, resources. We offer longer versions of this training for mandated reporters and for members of the public. So if you want to organize one of those, you can contact me as well. I appreciate your time. I think, Leo, we were going to have a little bit of time for questions here.
Yeah, why don't we, if there's any general questions for a few minutes, do that. And then if there's a lot of questions, we'll save them for a little longer, a little later in the session. But if anybody has, by the way, Sarah, can I get a PDF of this and we can share it with the folks that attended? And Anybody have a question for Sarah about? Yep, go ahead, Diane.
Okay, I have a couple, which I think are general. In general, do you handle complaints against guardians? That's A. B, I, as a volunteer, do review some of these complaints that get transferred back to DDS. So I just wondered if you could touch on some of the dispositions, what the different dispositions are, because I'm always a little confused about that.
Can you expand on what you mean by the different dispositions?
Well, some go on to the police to be investigated, some get turned back to DDS to be handled at the area level, or again, like I said, I review them as a volunteer, but I'm never really sure what the process is. Right?
Yeah.
It's been explained to me. I just think it might be helpful for folks to know, what once you complain, then what happens.
For sure. So different jurisdictions. So the intake specialist who mans the hotline, they are going to send it to a few of different places. So if it meets DPPC's jurisdiction, meaning adult with a disability between the age of 18 and 59, it may be sent to a DPPC investigator. But some of these other agencies like DDS, like the Department of Mental Health, like the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission, can also conduct investigations under the same jurisdiction. So sometimes we send it to them. Maybe they have particular expertise that is going to be useful in a particular case, or if they just have more investigators available at that given time, then we might send it to them as well. The police, I mentioned a little bit, they are screening all the reports that come in for criminal activity. So they will conduct their criminal investigations if necessary alongside our civil investigations. I believe there are certain cases where they will request that a civil investigation be paused while they conduct their criminal one, but it's pretty rare. And then if it doesn't meet our jurisdiction at all, we might send it to an agency that can cover that case. So for example, if the person is younger than 18, we'll send it to the Department of Children and Families. If they are older than 59, we'll send it to the Executive Office of Elder Affairs. So other agencies might be involved in that way. And can you remind me what your first question was? Because now I've talked too long and I forgot.
Do you field complaints about guardians who are not necessarily caregivers?
So I would have trouble thinking of a case when a guardian was not a caregiver. But I guess if someone was a guardian but not a caregiver, since we only investigate cases of abuse by caregivers, then no, we wouldn't investigate that. But I would think that, the vast majority of the time a guardian would be considered a caregiver. I would also say, it's sometimes hard to tell if someone is technically a caregiver or not. It gets into some legal stuff that, our legal team is much better at sussing out. So in cases like that, you want to just report anyway, and we will determine if they meet our definition of caregiver or not.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. We can have some more questions a little later as well if people still have questions. I'm going to shift gears here and invite Julie Westwater. I introduced earlier, for those of you that came on, she's the General Counsel at DPPC, and she's going to give us an update on the registry, and she might field some questions too. Right, Julie? So pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Leo. Thank you for the nice introduction. Happy New Year, everybody. I'm delighted to be here, and I actually want to start with a great big thank you to all of you on this call, because if not for your efforts to get an abuser registry in place, this was spearheaded by the ARC. I mean, you're the leaders of this project. I wouldn't be here speaking about it today, so I want to start out with that. I know there was just tremendous effort, led by Leo with the ARC, and a lot of people that had to come together and really advocate to get an abuser registry passed, the legislation passed. So I'm here to talk to you about kind of where we're at, but I would be remiss in not thanking you for being such a part of why we're even talking about this today. So the Abuser Registry, many of you probably know about it given your involvement with the ARC, but it was a several-year project by many, many advocates, and it really was designed to close the gap between criminal convictions and substantiated cases of abuse. So if you, and it was a great question earlier, Diane, about, you know, where do these cases go and how do they flow through the system? And some of the cases that go criminal will result in criminal convictions, and therefore if an employer was looking up somebody on a query and they had been convicted of a case against a person with a disability, that would pop on a query. However, there's a whole series of individuals who are substantiated for abuse by the Disabled Persons Protection Commission. However, for a number of different reasons, that case doesn't get criminally prosecuted, and perhaps it doesn't rise to the level of a crime, but we don't want these individuals working in the human services field given the abuse and neglect that they perpetrated against a person with a disability. So several years ago, many, many meetings, many working groups came together with some legislation which basically added a section on to the DPPC's statute, which charges us with creating an abuser registry. And the registry is for people who have been substantiated for registrable abuse against persons with intellectual and/or developmental disabilities. And I say that so specifically because the registry at this point is a first step. So it does not include care providers of persons with mental health or persons with physical disabilities. Right now, at this point, it was a first step. Let's get this registry in place. So it only captures registrable abuses of persons with intellectual or developmental disabilities. So we went live at the end of July, and before I go on with some of the statistics, I do want to note I have both Andrew Leveralt and I believe Mariah Friak are on this call. They are my two deputy general counsels without whom we could not have executed the charge, and I have them here for questions as well, but they have put a ton of time and thought into trying to figure out how do we create a registry that prevents abuses from going back into the system unnoticed by prospective employers. So we have been live, as I said, since July 31st. So any case of registrable abuse against an abuser as of July 31st will be considered registry eligible. What happens at that point is the case is investigated, and Sarah did a great job of describing how that happens within the system. If it is a care provider who is a subset of a caretaker, a care provider is somebody who works with folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and there's a very specific definition of an employer. So they have to be employed by somebody who licenses, contracts with, or is funded by the Department of Developmental Services. If that criteria is met, the investigator will do another piece of the investigation to determine whether this is a registrable abuse case, and that's basically meeting those criteria. So once that case goes into our system and it's substantiated here at the DPPC, as in all our cases, an individual is allowed to petition that finding with the DPPC. We do the initial petition and we look at, is this case substantiated abuse, and is it also registrable? And all cases will automatically be registrable unless an individual makes a petition and basically makes a claim that either the abuse didn't occur or perhaps the incident occurred, but it's isolated, unlikely to reoccur. They don't think that they should be taken out of the human service environment. And we take a look at that at the DPPC and make a determination whether we uphold that substantiation, whether we reverse it, or whether we find that, this incident did occur, but it's not the type of incident that would be considered to preclude an individual from ever working in the human service field with persons with disabilities. At that point, there is a second level of appeal, and that's to the Division of Administrative Law Appeals. And that's an administrative agency that does appeals for a number of administrative state agencies. And it's basically a second opportunity for an alleged abuser to be able to put their case in front of another administrative body separate and apart from the DPPC to take a look to see, did the DPPC get it right? Should I, in fact, be precluded from working with persons with disabilities? So that's basically how the system goes. There's also a third tier of review. If someone would want to appeal the dollar finding, they could go to Superior Court. So that's kind of just a capsule of how the system works. What we're doing now is figuring out all the mechanics behind it. So we created a portal, and all employers could register, and they are required by law now, by this Section 15, to vet any persons who are going to be working with persons with intellectual or developmental disabilities prior to hiring. They need the consent of the individual prior to running a search on the registry. However, if the individual does not consent to the search, they can't be hired. So once they get the consent from the individual, we now have a registry, and it will list the abusers who have been placed on the registry. And if you put somebody's name into that registry and that name pops, that employer is precluded from hiring that individual to work with persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So that's sort of just kind of a general summary of how it works. And as I said, we have been live since July 31st. So we've had some bumps along the road. We've learned a ton. We're improving as we go, but we feel really very confident that this is working as it should. And we're excited to see if we can expand it to other disabilities in the future. And I know Leo was a huge proponent of that. And we're going to try to move forward with that. But right now we have 6 individuals who are on the registry, and that's just in the past 5 months. So if you think about what had to happen, or the avenues of appeal that had to be afforded individuals, we feel like that's a great start. So there are 6 individuals out there whose name appears on a registry who will no longer be working with persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they are folks that may or may not have made it into the criminal system. So the idea of closing the gap between a criminal conviction and a substantiated abuse and making a difference in this workforce, I think is working well. We have had complete searches, almost 11,000 searches have been conducted since the end of July. So that means employers out there who are looking to hire have looked at almost 11,000 names. They've ran through that registry. So if you think, fast forward 10 years from now, more names are going to be on the registry. There's going to be more folks who are precluded from abusing and neglecting persons with disabilities. But right now we have 6 names on the registry. However, if you think of the deterrent effect, first, if you think you're on the registry you're abused or neglected somebody with disabilities, you may not sign that consent form. So before you even pass go, we're getting you out of this human services field. Secondly, once you sign that consent form, 11,000 names have been checked against that. So we're very confident that the deterrent effect is huge, even though right now we only have a half a dozen names actually on the registry itself. The number of employers is close to 200. So we've got 200 employers, and that can be huge employers. So there's several people. Some of these organizations employ and you know what the turnover is like in this field, they're looking at a lot of employment and they're running a lot of searches through this registry. We have about 507 current users. So that means there are over 500 people who have portal access. It's not a public registry, so it's not that anybody can get access to the registry. The information is confidential, but we have over 500 people who have valid access to our abuser registry and are running searches before hiring folks. We have about a dozen people who are in the queue in that process somewhere along the line in that process that I just described, where they've been substantiated for abuse and they're in the opportunity to appeal process. So we're looking at, I would say, in the next couple of months, adding a dozen or so more people either onto the registry or following them through the Division of Administrative Law Appeals. So that's kind of a snapshot of what it is and where we're at. I don't know if anybody has any specific questions that we can answer.
Yeah, please go ahead, Heather, go ahead.
Thank you. So I work with a lot of, well, it was great information. So thank you. I'm very happy that that's going to be in place. I work with a lot of families that hire their own PCAs. Do they have access to this registry?
So there is a self-determination program that DDS runs, which those folks would fall under this self-determination program. It's otherwise known as like the Real Lives program.
Yes.
And what we did was we thought of that, Heather, and tried to figure out how do the individuals have access. So what happens with those individuals is PPL is the intermediary that assists them with billing and all the other activities. They have access to the registry, so
Okay.
they can run those checks on behalf of the folks who are in the self-determination program hiring their own care providers.
Okay. Okay, great.
That's a great
Thank you.
question, though.
Thank you.
I have a
But
question.
Julie, one second, Julie, but people who hire a PCA as a rule, though, separate from DDS, because you were clear it's DDS, they would not have access yet. That's a whole other thing to figure out once, we successfully, all of us work together to expand it, right? That would be to have the
That's-
average individual have access, given the advocacy to keep that information controlled, right?
That's correct. And I don't know if Drew or Mariah want to speak to that more specifically, but that's like in progress of trying to figure out how we actually get access to individuals. And it wasn't something that was feasible out of the gate. Drew or Mariah, I don't know if you have any additional information on that or want to add.
No, I mean, I don't have anything else to add. As you said, I mean, if there's no DDS funding, then the individual wouldn't have the opportunity to search. I mean, down the line, we'll probably try to follow a similar model and work with the fiscal intermediaries, the Stavros and those agencies to do the vetting through the registry, if and when that was, the registry was to be expanded.
Okay, thanks, Drew. Anybody else? For
Yes,
Julie?
I
Yeah.
have a question. Lucy, what happens when a person turns beyond 59? You said they have to, their complaints go to Elder Affairs. But the person is still served by DDS. Do you work cooperatively with that? Do they have any similar kinds of programs in place? Is there a way for a person to stay with the DDS service, the Disability Law Center service?
So once an individual goes past the age of 59, even if they are still served by DDS, they are outside of the jurisdiction of DPPC. So we have no jurisdictional authority to investigate a case against an elder. As Sarah mentioned, that would be a case that we would screen to elder services and they would do an investigation. but that individual would be outside of our jurisdiction. So would that perpetrator, we would not have done an investigation of, so they would not be on the registry. And like I said, the idea is to try to expand this registry, at least starting with the rest of our population, which is physical abuse and mental health. But at some point, it would really be terrific to have a registry that spanned, you know, DCF, DPPC, elder affairs. That's kind of a ways down the road, I would say. But yes, Lucy, they would be outside of our jurisdiction, so the Executive Office of Elder Affairs would handle that situation and that investigation.
So would there be a way, though, that the person that's working with the elderly person over 59 years old is working in a DDS program where there may be younger people, would there still be the possibility that the DDS DLC investigation would be carried out? Because that person is not only serving, you know, is serving everybody in the house.
Yes, so I would say that if there is an allegation that that individual could be abusing or neglecting others in that program, that would fall under the jurisdiction of the DPPC, absolutely. We would do an investigation there. And there is this, as Drew mentioned, there's kind of these odd situations where you could have an abuser who could be on the registry and another abuser working in the same program that would not be on the registry because they did not meet the definition of an employer or a care provider.
Mm-hmm.
Drew, do you have anything to add to that?
Just to sort of clarify on that situation, so if the individual's in a program that's you know, a DDS licensed program, then DDS will still conduct a regulatory investigation under 115 CMR 9, and they have a similar jurisdiction, or excuse me, their regulatory findings are very similar to the DPPCs. They can substantiate abuse, but as Julie mentioned, because they're over the age of 59, they won't be within the DPPC's jurisdiction, and then they wouldn't be eligible for registry placement. And yeah, just to follow up on the question that was in the chat room, and Mariah answered this, why the arbitrary cutoff of 59, that's just a matter of statute. That's just, you know, DCF is up to 18, we're 18 to 59, and then Elder Affairs is 60 and above.
Would there ever be a way to change that? I mean, with advocacy, or do those age limits have to apply?
Well, it's all about, like Julie said, it's just about rolling it out over time, taking each piece at a time. And so right now we have a bill to make sure the language of enabling DPPC and the new language for the registry are consistent. So that's literally a top priority for us. And related to that is expanding the registry to rehabilitation, where we won't get into wars with other groups. We won't have to worry about the broader pictures. Obviously, we would have loved to go in the PCA. We would have loved to have, you know, done that, but that requires more negotiation and discussion. And the same with this age stuff. And I think it's something to talk about, to do earlier than later, but it may not be feasible until the broader picture is worked out. So there's a lot of details in this that, you know, luckily they've had to take apart as they've implemented the registry. So we'll learn from their implementation what some of the issues are. And we haven't had a chance. I think the advisory board talks about it, but we haven't organizationally had a chance to chat about it. But I know Maura's been hearing about it, Maura Sullivan at our office, through her participation and others participating with DPPC on that advisory board. So there's a lot that had to be done. And this is it. Every law you pass, I mean, we're our own, you know, enemies sometimes. We develop a law and then we realize, oh my God, but when we developed the law, we've got this limitation on this side of it, you know? So we did this one with our eyes open, though, just to be clear. And there was another law in play and written after the law we all had worked on together, and including the big Facebook groups that ended up allying together, the Chans and the Dana's law and Nikki's law, you know, all got aligned and originally Dana's law was a broader law, but it just seemed, you know, it was so broad, it wasn't gonna, you know, the legislature was wary of a large bill right away, you know? So, and so we went and took a, you know, we stuck with the Nikki's law, focusing on IDD and DDS, and, you know, knowing it was a apple half bitten or whatever, however you want to look at it. So
I think it would be interesting to know how many people who are in DDS programs who are now over the 59 age.
Yeah, it would help us for sure too in our advocacy too, Lucy. Thank you. It's a great suggestion.
And DDS would definitely be able to provide that information.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else? We're running on overtime, but this is such an important topic. I don't want to, anybody else have a question before we? Okay. I have actually a question, but I'm going to save it for 4 o'clock. So I'll save it for later
I'll
today.
leave you with one success story though, Leo. The first
Okay.
case that we had, the individual in the interim, because of course this process takes time and they have 10 business days to file an appeal. In the interim, that individual had gone and moved into another job in the human services field, working with a DDS provider. And we were able to, once that case was substantiated, notify that new employer,
Wow.
and that individual was
Great.
taken out of that job. So it was a great first story, I think, about how this can be really, really effective and can be on a large scale once we get up and running.
No, that's great. So, because we were worried in the negotiations when the, you know, number of days kicked in and the whole, as it was with the appeal process, which we were going to have all along, how many days we allow people to take, right, to appeal, all of
Right.
that good stuff. That's great. What a good, and it looks like Andrew dropped in his information if people have questions, but also, and it's Drew or Andrew, I'm just so you know, I was talking about the same person. And then Mariah dropped in some informational pieces as well on the chat if people want to grab that. And all right, yeah, thank you. This is really helpful. Sarah, again, thank you for being with us. Julie, just, you know, pleasure as always. Thank you for that presentation.
so
and
much.
Drew
Thank
and
you, everyone.
Mariah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
And
you.
everybody,
Take care.
have a
Happy
great-
New Year.
Happy
Have a
New
great
Year.
week. Happy New Year, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Take
Take care.
care. Bye-bye.